So today we're gonna go over, guys, James. We're gonna go over just sort of the basics of Protists, talk about some general characteristics, talk about the different categories of Protists. Then next week we'll start talking about specifics and specific Protists that we're going to look at. We need to know the parts of them and work on some drawing. So first of all, the domain. So we learned earlier this week there's 3 domains. Which one do Protists belong to? Raise your hand if you could tell me what domain are they.
What?
Abby?
Either phylum or bacteria.
No, those aren't domains. There's 3 big domains.
Oh,
Matt?
Archaea?
Yes. Remember, there's archaea, there's the bacteria kingdom, and then there's eukarya. And protists are part of that. Protist domain is eukarya, and their kingdom is called protist or protista.
What does it mean?
Protista? I'm not sure where the name, like the origin of the name comes from. It's a good question. I'll check that out. And so we already know some of their characteristics because we talked about them when we went over the 6 kingdoms. So protists, tell me about them in terms of number of cells. What word would you use to describe them? Tatum? They're unicellular. What about their nucleus? What word would you use to describe them? Gavin?
They're... Oh.
Eukaryote. And how about their nutrition? How they get energy? Nathan?
Or both.
They're both. There are some that are heterotrophs, there are some that are autotrophs. Okay? So they're unicellular, eukaryotic, and some heterotrophs, some autotrophs. And they generally live in the water. But there are also some that live inside of other organisms. And we'll talk about one specific example of that. So these unicellular organisms, how would you guess, what type of reproduction do you think they have? Matt? Yeah, they reproduce by a process of reproduction that's called binary fission. Binary, that word means 2 parts, and fission means to split. And so binary fission is basically splitting into 2 parts. It's a form of asexual reproduction, like Matt just said. And we know asexual reproduction, there's only one parent organism. And basically just splits into identical offspring. It copies its DNA and splits into it. This is an amoeba. That's one of the protists. You could see the original parent cell has this one nucleus in it. And this amoeba we're going to reproduce through binary fission. The nucleus first is copied. That's shown here. So we have 2 nucleuses. And then the amoeba just kind of splits in half. One nucleus is in each of the cells. And at the end, we have 2 amoeba. So this one parent amoeba has produced 2 daughter cells. They are identical to each other. Because the nucleus was copied here, they have the same DNA.
How do they know if it's a boy or girl?
There is no gender in amoeba. So those are some basics about protists in general. And when we look at protists, they are classified based on how they move. And there's 4 groups that we're going to learn about. Amoeboids, ciliates, flagellates, and sporozoans. And the way an amoeba moves around, it has this cell membrane and cytoplasm that just sort of oozes around. It kind of blobs forward. So the amoeba sends out these cytoplasm things and then kind of pulls itself along to move from place to place. It just sort of oozes forward.
What do they mean by false feet?
Yeah, so this word pseudopod, when the amoeba sort of sends out this cytoplasm, those are called pseudopods. The word means false feet, like a podiatrist is a doctor that works on people's feet. That root means feet. Pseudo means like not true, like false. So pseudopods are false feet because it moves around using these kind of blobbing forward motions. And that's how an amoeba gets around. It's also, as we're going to learn next week, how it eats. Then we have the ciliates. They move around through the water using these tiny little hairs that surround them on the outside. And those hairs, which are called cilia, they sort of act like little paddles, sort of paddling the protist through the water. So it swims by moving all of these little cilia at one time. And this is the one we're going to study. It's called the Paramecium. We'll see it next week. Yeah, you have some different pictures. Then we have the flagellates. How do you think this moves? With that tail. That tail is called a flagellum. It's a whip-like tail that sort of whips around and moves the protist through the water. This is called the euglena. We'll look at that next week also. Natalie?
How come it looks so different compared to them?
Yeah, it's just sort of different views. The ones that you give in your notes are microscope images. Okay, these are just drawings.
Which they could look all different kinds.
Yeah, we'll see some other pictures next week. The last type are the sporozoans. And the sporozoans are different because they don't really move on their own. These sporozoans are mainly parasites. They live inside of other organisms. One example that we're going to learn about, and one example you've already, I know, learned about, is Plasmodium. Plasmodium is a parasite, a protist. Gets into a person's body, makes them sick, makes them ill, causes a disease that affects millions of people throughout the world. And from what I was told, it's a disease that you guys spent a lot of time studying last year. It's a tropical disease.
Malaria. What's it called?
Malaria.
Oh, yeah.
Malaria.
Never heard of it in my life.
Malaria is a disease caused by this protist. But what spreads that protist from person to person? Specifically, mosquitoes. Mosquitoes, we're going to read an article about malaria and watch a video. Mosquitoes bite a person who's infected with malaria. Some of the protist gets into the mosquito, and then if they bite another person, they can spread that protist to them and spread the illness, spread the disease from person to person. It's not contagious like if you cough on somebody, they would get it, but it is in terms of transfer from one person's blood to another. And that's why mosquitoes can spread it. Mosquito bites me and I have malaria. It can acquire some of that Plasmodium protist, and then if it goes and bites you, some of that Plasmodium could get into you as well.
Wait, how does it start off then if someone has automatic malaria and they get it from them? How does it get to them in the first place?
It's spread from another person. And the original origin of that disease, I don't know.
Don't the mosquitoes bite you, and then they drink on your blood, and that malaria is in your blood, and then they go and they drink someone else's blood, but then some of your blood gets into the other.
Yeah, and that parasite also has like a life cycle within the mosquito. So it's not it's not like mixing of blood that's the problem. It's that they get the Plasmodium protist in them, goes through its life cycle, and then they can inject it into somebody else.
And what's Zika?
Zika is another mosquito-borne illness, a virus that can be spread from person to person through a mosquito. It's just a different, so there are lots of different diseases that can be spread by insects, like mosquitoes. And those are just some examples: Zika virus, or sleeping sickness, or malaria. There's a lot of illnesses that are sometimes spread by these insects. All right, so that's how we're going to talk about for protists today. I just want to introduce them. We'll get into the specifics next week.